The dust never settled in Clearwater County. Maya Delgado had grown accustomed to the taste of it on her lips, the way it clung to her work clothes, no matter how many times she washed them in the ancient machine that wheezed and groaned in the back of her trailer. Today, as she stood outside Hannigan's Feed and Supply, the dust seemed heavier somehow, weighted with the whispers and sideways glances of the townspeople who had gathered for what they were calling the reading. The lawyer's BMW looked absurdly out of place among the pickup trucks and rusted sedans that lined Main Street. Its pristine black paint reflected the harsh Montana sun like a mirror, sending sharp flashes of light across the weathered storefronts and into Maya's eyes as she approached the building. She pulled her worn baseball cap lower, shielding her face not just from the glare, but from the curious stares that followed her every step. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Buck Morrison from his perch on the bench outside the hardware store. His voice carried the particular brand of disdain reserved for those who believed they'd seen it all and didn't much care for what they were seeing now. Old Sam really did it. He left everything to help. If you're enjoying this incredible story of hidden history and determination, take a moment to like this video and let me know in the comments what you think Maya should do next. She'd worked at Samuel McKinnon's ranch for 7 years, starting as a 16-year-old runaway with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination to prove she belonged somewhere. Sam had found her sleeping in his barn one morning, curled up between hay bales like a lost kitten, and instead of calling the sheriff, he'd offered her a job and a chance at something resembling a home. Now, at 23, Maya had calluses on her hands that told the story of every fence she'd mended, every horse she'd broken, every pre-dawn morning she'd spent moving cattle across the vast expanse of McKinnon land. She knew the creek bed, every hidden valley, every secret place where the old man used to sit and watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. The ranch wasn't just where she worked, it was where she'd learned to live. But knowing the land and owning it were two entirely different things, and the assembled crowd made their feelings about that distinction abundantly clear. 23 years old, and she inherits the biggest spread in the county, whispered Helen Cartwright to her neighbor, her voice pitched just loud enough to ensure Maya could hear every word. "What's a girl like that gonna do with 8,000 acres? Probably sell it to some developer from California." Maya's jaw tightened. A girl like that. She'd heard variations of that phrase her entire life, usually preceded by assumptions about her heritage, her background, her worth, leaving her to bounce between foster homes until she'd finally had enough of the system and struck out on her own. In Clearwater County, that combination of circumstances made her an outsider 3 times over. The lawyer, a thin man with silver hair and an expensive suit, cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses as Maya entered the feed store. The usual smell of grain and leather was overwhelmed by the cologne and coffee breath of 24 ranchers and their wives, all of whom had suddenly discovered urgent business that required their presence at Hannigan's this particular Tuesday morning. "Miss Delgado," said the lawyer, his voice formal but not unkind, "I'm Richard Pemberton, from Pemberton, Hayes and Associates in Billings. Thank you for coming." Maya nodded, acutely aware of how her boots sounded against the wooden floor, how her faded jeans and work shirt stood out among the pressed slacks and button-downs of the other attendees. These people had dressed for an occasion. She had dressed for work, because that's what she'd been doing when the call came 3 days ago, informing her that Sam was dead and that she needed to be present for the reading of his will. "Heart attack," the coroner had said, "quick and clean, the way Sam would have wanted it."
She'd found him in the barn, slumped against the feed bin with a peaceful expression on his weathered face, as if he'd simply decided to take a nap in the middle of his morning chores. She'd called 911, performed CPR until the paramedics arrived, and held his hand as they loaded him into the ambulance. But she'd known from the moment she'd seen him that Sam McKinnon was gone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pemberton began, unfolding a thick document, "we're here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Samuel McKinnon, dated March 15th of this year." March 15th. Maya remembered that day clearly because it was the first warm day of spring, and Sam had been unusually quiet during their morning ride to check on the new calves. She had assumed he was thinking about the approaching calving season, or maybe the repairs needed on the east fence line. She never imagined he was contemplating his mortality. "To my dear friend and neighbor, Frank Morrison, I leave my collection of vintage spurs and my grandfather's Colt 45, with the hope that they'll remind you of our poker games and the tall tales we told." Frank Morrison, Buck's older brother and one of Sam's closest friends, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. The crowd murmured approvingly. This was what they had expected: sentimental gifts to old friends, maybe a few acres to longtime neighbors, the bulk of the estate going to some distant relative or charitable organization. "To the Clearwater County Cattlemen's Association, I leave the sum of $50,000 to support the annual scholarship program." More nods of approval. Sam had been a pillar of the community, the kind of man who believed in helping the next generation learn the business. The scholarship would ensure his name lived on in a way that honored his memory. "To Helen Cartwright, who kept me fed with her famous apple pies for 30 years, I leave my grandmother's china set and the sum of $10,000. Helen gasped and pressed her hand to her chest, tears flowing freely. The crowd was warming up now, caught up in the emotion of the moment, the satisfaction of seeing their expectations confirmed. But then Pemberton's voice took on a different tone, more formal, more deliberate. "And now we come to the disposition of the McKinnon Ranch, including all buildings, livestock, equipment, and the full 8,000 acres of deeded land." The room fell silent. This was the moment they'd all come for, the revelation that would determine the future of one of the county's most valuable properties. Maya felt her heart hammering against her ribs as every eye in the room turned toward her, some curious, some hostile, all waiting to see her disappointment when the ranch went to someone more deserving. "I, Samuel McKinnon, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the entirety of my ranch, including all land, buildings, livestock, equipment, and personal property contained thereon, to Maya Delgado, who has been more of a daughter to me than any blood relation could have been." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, broken only by the sound of someone's sharp intake of breath and the distant lowing of cattle in the stockyards behind the building. Then the room exploded into chaos. "You've got to be kidding me!" Buck Morrison sputtered, rising from his chair with his face flushed red. 8,000 acres to a ranch hand? That old fool finally lost his mind. "She's not even family," someone else shouted. "How is this legal?" 23 years old, Helen Cartwright said again, but this time her voice carried venom instead of concern. "What's she gonna do? Turn it into one of those dude ranches for city people?" Maya stood frozen in the center of the storm, her mind struggling to process what she just heard. The ranch, all of it, the land that had become her sanctuary, the cattle that she knew by sight, the house where Sam had taught her to cook and to read books about history and science and far-off places she'd never thought she'd see. It was hers. Furthermore, Pemberton said, raising his voice above the din, Mr. McKinnon has left explicit instructions regarding the property. Miss Delgado is to have full and unrestricted access to all buildings and contents, with the understanding that she will maintain the ranch as a working cattle operation for a minimum of 5 years. 5 years, Maya whispered, the words barely audible above the angry voices surrounding her. 5 years, to prove she belonged here, to show these people that Sam's faith in her hadn't been misplaced. 5 years to figure out how a girl with no family, no money, and no formal education was going to manage one of the largest ranches in Montana. "This is insane," declared Tom Hannigan, the owner of the feed store. "Sam McKinnon was a smart man, but this is going to destroy everything he built. You mark my words, she'll run that place into the ground within a year." Maya felt the familiar burn of defiance rising in her chest, the same feeling that had carried her through 7 years of proving herself in a world that seemed determined to count her out before she even started. She lifted her chin and met Tom Hannigan's gaze directly. "Mr. McKinnon taught me everything I know about ranching. I've been managing the day-to-day operations for the past 3 years while he dealt with his health issues. The ranch has turned a profit every year. Working for Sam and running your own operation are 2 different things," Frank Morrison said, his tone gentler than his brother's, but no less skeptical. "There's bookkeeping, taxes, insurance, negotiations with buyers. It's more than just knowing which end of a cow gets up first." "I can learn," Maya replied. "Sam believed I could learn." Sam was a sentimental old fool, always picking up strays and trying to save the world. This is what it gets you. Your life's work handed over to someone who's gonna throw it all away because she doesn't know any better. The words hit Maya like physical blows, each one designed to make her doubt herself, to make her feel small and unworthy of the gift Sam had given her. But underneath the hurt, she felt something else stirring. A deep, burning anger that reminded her why she had survived everything life had thrown at her so far. "You don't know me," she said, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "You've watched me work for 7 years, seen me in town, at church, at every community event Sam dragged me to, and you still don't know me. All you see is what you want to see. Someone who doesn't belong, someone who doesn't deserve what she's been given." She turned slowly, making eye contact with as many faces as she could, seeing the mixture of curiosity, resentment, and barely concealed hostility that she'd grown used to over the years. Sam McKinnon saw something different. He saw someone who showed up every day, no matter the weather, no matter how tired or sick or discouraged she was. He saw someone who cared about the land, about the animals, about preserving something that mattered. And he trusted that person enough to leave her everything he'd worked for.
Maya's first night as the owner of McKinnon Ranch was sleepless and haunted by the sound of wind whistling through gaps in her trailer's aluminum siding. She'd moved into the main house yet. It felt too soon, too presumptuous, like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Sam's coffee cup still sat in the kitchen sink, his reading glasses folded on the table beside yesterday's newspaper. The house held his presence so strongly that Maya couldn't bring herself to disturb it, not yet. Instead, she lay on her narrow trailer bed, clutching Sam's letter in hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the lawyer had placed it in her palm. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper that felt expensive between her fingers,
so different from the rough manila folders and torn notebook pages that usually passed for official documents in her world. Her name was written across it in Sam's careful script, Maya Elena Delgado, with flourishes on the capital letters that spoke of an education she'd never received, a refinement she never possessed. The letter had been in her jacket pocket for 6 hours, growing warm from her body heat, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. Once she read Sam's final words, there would be no taking them back, no pretending this was all some elaborate mistake that would resolve itself with time and good intentions. The ranch would truly be hers, with all the responsibility and impossibility that entailed. At 3 in the morning, with sleep nowhere to be found, Maya finally surrendered to the inevitable. She switched on the bedside lamp, its yellow glow casting harsh shadows across the trailer's cramped interior, and carefully tore open the envelope's seal. The letter was written on matching stationery, page after page of Sam's measured handwriting flowing across expensive paper like a river of intention and hope. Maya had to blink away tears before she could focus on the words, many of which she didn't fully understand, but trusted Sam's careful explanations. My dear Maya, if you're reading this, that I've finally gotten around to dying, and you've just discovered that an old cowboy's faith in you has turned your world upside down. I imagine you're scared, confused, and probably more than a little angry at me for putting you in this position without warning you first. That's fair. I would be angry too. But let me tell you something that I never said often enough while I was alive to say it. You are the finest person I've ever known. Not the finest woman, not the finest ranch hand, not the finest anything with qualifiers and limitations. You are simply the finest human being it has been my privilege to watch grow from a broken child into a remarkable adult. I know what they're all saying in town by now. I know the looks you're getting, the whispers behind your back, the predictions about how long it will take you to fail. They were wrong about you then, and they're wrong about you now. Maya had to stop reading and wipe her eyes with the back of her hand. Even in death, Sam knew exactly what she needed to hear, exactly how to reach through her fear and doubt to touch the part of her that still believed she might be worth something after all. You're going to want to quit, probably in the next few days, certainly within the first few months. When the bills start coming in and you realize what it costs to keep 8,000 acres operational, when you have to negotiate with cattle buyers who think they can take advantage of a young woman who doesn't know the business, when equipment breaks down and contractors quote you prices that would make a banker weep, you're going to want to walk away. Don't. The ranch isn't just land and cattle and machinery. It's a way of life that's disappearing from this world one family farm at a time, one corporate buyout at a time. It's a connection to something bigger than ourselves, to the land that sustains us and the animals that trust us to care for them properly. It's history and future wrapped up in 8,000 acres of Montana soil. And I'm trusting you to preserve it for the next generation.
But there's something else. Something I should have told you years ago, but never found the courage to share. The ranch holds secrets, Maya. Some of them are wonderful. Some of them are valuable. And some of them will change how you understand the world. I've left you more than just a working cattle operation. I've left you a mystery that will take time to unravel. Start with the big barn, the one we always kept locked. You'll find the key in my desk drawer, wrapped in an old handkerchief that belonged to my grandmother. What you discover there will explain why I was so insistent about you learning to read scientific journals, why I made you take those correspondence courses in geology and paleontology, even when you complained they were too hard. The land chose you, Maya, just as surely as I did. Trust in that. Trust in yourself. And remember that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the greatest challenges. With all my love and faith, Samuel McKinnon. P.S. Don't let Buck Morrison's negativity poison your well. That man has been jealous of this ranch since we were boys, and he'll use any excuse to try to tear down what we've built. You're stronger than his small-mindedness, and you're smarter than he'll ever give you credit for being. Maya read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated the fog of exhaustion and emotional overload. Scientific journals? Correspondence courses? Paleontology? The locked barn that Sam had always claimed was full of old equipment and family heirlooms too precious to risk exposing to the weather? What kind of secrets could be hidden in a barn on a cattle ranch in Montana? What had Sam discovered that he'd felt compelled to keep to himself for all these years? And why had he been so determined to educate her in subjects that had nothing to do with ranching? The questions multiplied in her mind like cattle scattering across a pasture. But they would have to wait for daylight and courage and the key that supposedly waited in Sam's desk drawer. For now, Maya folded the letter carefully and placed it on her nightstand, where Sam's words could keep watch over what remained of her restless night. Dawn came too early, and not early enough, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Maya why she'd fallen in love with this place 7 years ago. The beauty of Montana mornings never failed to take her breath away, the way the light seemed to emerge from the land itself rather than simply falling upon it from above. On mornings like this, she could almost believe that anything was possible, that even a girl with no family and no money could find a way to make herself worthy of such a magnificent country. The illusion lasted exactly as long as it took her to walk from the trailer to the main barn and find 3 of her best breeding cows lying dead in the pasture, their bodies already beginning to swell in the morning heat. Maya's stomach dropped as she approached the carcasses, her trained eye taking in details that made her heart race with panic and rage. The cows hadn't died from disease or predation. Their throats had been cut with surgical precision, the wounds clean and deliberate, designed to cause rapid blood loss without damaging the valuable hides. This wasn't the work of wolves or coyotes or any natural predator. This was sabotage, pure and simple. And the message it sent was as clear as the Montana sky. You don't belong here, and we're going to make your life hell until you accept that fact. Son of a bitch, Maya whispered, kneeling beside the nearest cow, a gentle Angus named Molly who had always come running when Maya called her name. The animal's eyes were still open, staring sightlessly at the sky she would never see again, and Maya had to fight down a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the smell of death and everything to do with the cruelty of human nature. She spent the next 2 hours on the phone with the sheriff's department, the insurance company, and the veterinarian reporting the crime and arranging for the carcasses to be removed before they contaminated the pasture. The conversations were exercises in frustration, each official expressing sympathy while making it clear that rustling and cattle killings were notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when there were no witnesses and plenty of people in the county who might have motives for wanting to drive the new ranch owner out of business. "You got any enemies?" asked Deputy Martinez when he finally arrived to document the scene. He was a young man, probably not much older than Maya herself, with intelligent eyes and a professional manner that managed to be both respectful and skeptical. "Take your pick," Maya replied, gesturing toward town with a bitter laugh.
Half the county thinks I stole this ranch from its rightful owners. The other half thinks I'm too incompetent to keep it running. Either way, there are plenty of people who'd be happy to see me fail." Martinez nodded and made notes in his report, but Maya could see in his expression that he had little hope of finding the perpetrators. In a county where everyone knew everyone else's business, there were still codes of silence that protected the old families from consequences, especially when those consequences might benefit an outsider who didn't know her place.
But beneath the fear and anger, Maya felt something else stirring. The same stubborn determination that had carried her through 7 years of proving herself in a world that seemed designed to defeat her. Whoever had killed her cattle had made a fundamental mistake. They'd assumed that intimidation would make her back down. What they'd actually done was remind her that she had something worth fighting for. The locked barn stood like a monument to secrets at the far end of the ranch complex, its weathered wood siding and corrugated metal roof giving it the appearance of just another agricultural outbuilding. Maya had walked past it thousands of times over the years, accepting Sam's explanation that it contained family heirlooms and old equipment too valuable to leave exposed to the elements. Now, armed with Sam's letter and the growing certainty that nothing about her inheritance was as simple as it appeared, she approached the building with new eyes and a racing heart. The key was exactly where Sam had promised it would be, wrapped in a yellowed cotton handkerchief in the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. The metal was old and tarnished, its weight substantial in Maya's palm as she walked across the yard toward answers she wasn't sure she was prepared to receive. The barn's interior was darker than she'd expected, shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the siding to create dramatic columns of illuminated dust motes. But as her eyes adjusted to the dimness, Maya realized that what she'd assumed would be a storage space filled with forgotten farm equipment was actually something far more extraordinary. The entire center of the barn had been converted into what could only be described as a scientific laboratory. Work tables lined with precise instruments, glass cases containing what appeared to be fossils and mineral specimens, and floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with journals, reference books, and manila folders thick with documentation. This wasn't the workshop of a simple cattle rancher. This was the research facility of a serious scientist, hidden away from prying eyes in the most unlikely of locations. Maya moved through the space like a sleepwalker, her hands trailing over equipment she recognized from the paleontology textbooks Sam had insisted she study during their long winter evenings. Microscopes, calipers, brushes and chisels for excavation work, plaster for making casts of fossil specimens. The tools were expensive and professional grade, maintained with the same careful attention Sam had given to his ranch equipment. But it was the far end of the barn that stopped Maya in her tracks and sent her heart hammering against her ribs with an intensity that made her dizzy. There, illuminated by a carefully arranged system of LED lights, stood what could only be described as the skeleton of a giant. The bones were arranged on a custom-built frame that elevated them several feet off the ground, allowing viewers to walk beneath and around the complete skeleton. Maya estimated its height at nearly 12 feet, its proportions massive but undeniably human. The skull was elongated, the jaw powerful, the limbs thick with muscle attachment points that spoke of incredible physical strength. But it was unmistakably the skeleton of a humanoid creature, something that walked upright and used tools and possessed the intelligence to build and create and destroy. Maya circled the skeleton slowly, her scientific training warring with disbelief and wonder. This was impossible. Humans had never grown to such proportions, not in recorded history, not in the fossil record as she understood it. Yet here was physical evidence that contradicted everything she thought she knew about human evolution and development. A thick folder lay open on the nearest work table, its contents revealing pages of Sam's careful notes, photographs of the excavation site, correspondence with laboratories and universities, and what appeared to be preliminary estimates of the skeleton's age and significance. Maya's hand shook as she tried to understand Sam's conclusions, the scientific terms mostly foreign to her, despite his teaching efforts.
The skeleton was approximately 15,000 years old, predating known human civilization in North America by several millennia. Carbon dating of bone samples had been confirmed by 3 separate laboratories, each reaching the same impossible conclusion. The remains showed no signs of disease or deformity that might explain the creature's unusual size. Instead, they appeared to represent a previously unknown branch of human evolution, a race of giants who had lived and died in the American West thousands of years before the first European explorers set foot on the continent. But it was the final page of Sam's notes that made Maya's legs weak and forced her to grip the edge of the work table for support. According to his research, similar skeletal remains had been discovered throughout the American West over the past century, always in remote locations, always by people who lacked the scientific training to understand their significance. Most had been dismissed as hoaxes or misidentified as extinct animal species. Those that had been studied seriously had mysteriously disappeared from museums and universities, their existence denied or covered up by institutions that couldn't afford to challenge established scientific orthodoxy. Sam had spent 30 years documenting these disappearances, corresponding with researchers who'd been discredited for pursuing similar investigations, building a case for the existence of a prehistoric race of giants that powerful people seemed to be determined to keep hidden from public knowledge. His skeleton was the most complete specimen ever discovered, and his research represented the most comprehensive investigation ever conducted into what he termed the giant people of the ancient West. At the bottom of the final page, Sam had written one last note in red ink, his handwriting more urgent than usual. Maya, they know about the skeleton. That's why I had to leave everything to you instead of donating it to a museum. Universities can be bought, scientists can be silenced, but a private landowner who owns the discovery site has rights that are harder to circumvent. Protect this. The world needs to know the truth about our history. Maya sank into the chair beside the work table, her mind reeling with implications she was only beginning to understand. Sam hadn't left her just a ranch. He'd left her the most important archaeological discovery in human history, along with the responsibility of protecting it from forces that would rather see it destroyed than revealed to the world. The weight of that responsibility was almost overwhelming. She was 23 years old, with a high school education and 7 years of experience managing cattle. What did she know about scientific research, about dealing with universities and museums, about navigating the complex world of academic politics and institutional cover-ups? But as she sat in the barn, surrounded by evidence of Sam's decades-long investigation, Maya began to understand why he'd insisted on her education in subjects that seemed irrelevant to ranch life. The correspondence courses in geology and paleontology, the scientific journals he'd made her read, the long discussions about critical thinking and research methodology.
He'd been preparing her for this moment, training her to be the guardian of a secret that could change human understanding of our species' history. Outside the barn, Maya could hear the distant sound of cattle moving across the pasture, the normal rhythms of ranch life continuing despite the extraordinary discovery hidden away from the world. She thought about the 3 dead cows, about Buck Morrison's sneering dismissal of her capabilities, about the whispered predictions that she would fail within a year. None of them knew what Sam had really left her. None of them understood that the McKinnon Ranch was now the most important archaeological site in North America, possibly in the world. They saw only a young woman who'd inherited more than she deserved, more than she could handle. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. Maya stood up from the chair and walked back to the giant skeleton, studying its ancient bones in the LED light that made them seem to glow with their own inner fire. Somewhere in the distant past, this creature had walked the same land she now owned, had seen the same mountains and valleys, had lived and loved and died under the same vast Montana sky. Now it was her responsibility to ensure that its story was told, that the truth about humanity's hidden history was finally brought to light. It wouldn't be easy. There would be skeptics and deniers, powerful interests that would try to suppress or discredit her findings, academic institutions that would dismiss her as an unqualified amateur playing at science. But she had something they didn't expect. The iron determination of someone who'd spent her entire life proving that she belonged in places where others said she had no right to be. She'd learned to survive on stubbornness and spite, to thrive on the satisfaction of proving her doubters wrong.
This time, she wasn't just fighting for her own future. She was fighting for truth, for history, for the right of all humanity to know the full story of our species' incredible journey through time. The giants had waited 15,000 years for their story to be told. Maya Delgado intended to make sure their wait was finally over. By day, she threw herself into the visible work of running McKinnon Ranch, moving cattle, repairing fences, meeting with feed suppliers and veterinarians, learning the intricate dance of cash flow and profit margins that kept a working ranch operational. By night, she became a different person entirely, hunched over Sam's research files in the converted laboratory, teaching herself the complex vocabulary of archaeological science and slowly beginning to understand the true magnitude of what she'd inherited. The giant skeleton dominated her thoughts and dreams. She'd taken to spending hours simply sitting beside it, studying the ancient bones under the careful lighting Sam had installed, trying to imagine the creature as it had lived 15,000 years ago. The skull was particularly mesmerizing, its proportions suggesting intelligence and awareness that challenged everything she thought she knew about prehistoric humanity. Sometimes, in the shifting LED light, she could almost see expression in the empty eye sockets, as if the ancient being was trying to communicate across the vast gulf of time. Sam's research files painted a picture of systematic suppression that made Maya's blood run cold. Document after document detailed the disappearance of similar skeletal remains from museums and universities across the American West. Researchers who had attempted to study or publicize such findings had found their careers destroyed, their funding eliminated, their reputations ruined by whisper campaigns that portrayed them as pseudoscientists chasing fantasies. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Someone or some organization had been working for decades to ensure that evidence of prehistoric giants remained hidden from public knowledge. Sam's notes suggested several possible culprits:
government agencies concerned about disrupting established historical narratives, religious institutions threatened by discoveries that contradicted creation stories, even corporate interests that profited from maintaining certain versions of American prehistory. But it was a manila folder labeled Recent Activity that made Maya's hands shake as she read its contents. Sam had documented increasing pressure over the past 2 years, mysterious visitors asking questions about his hobby, break-in attempts at the ranch, even subtle threats delivered through intermediaries who claimed to represent interested parties willing to pay handsomely for any unusual artifacts he might have discovered. The most recent entry, dated just 3 weeks before Sam's death, described a late-night phone call from someone claiming to represent the Smithsonian Institution. The caller had been polite, but insistent, offering to purchase any paleontological specimens Sam might have found on his property, with payment amounts that started at 7 figures and escalated quickly when Sam expressed reluctance to discuss the matter. This story keeps getting more intense. If you're invested in Maya's journey to uncover the truth, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who loves mysteries. You won't believe what happens next. The timing was too convenient, coming just as outside pressure was intensifying and just after he'd updated his will to leave everything to Maya. She thought about the peaceful expression on his face when she had found him in the barn, the complete absence of any signs of struggle or distress. What if he hadn't died of a heart attack? What if someone had found a way to eliminate a problem that money couldn't solve? The possibility that Sam had been murdered filled Maya with a cold fury that burned brighter than any grief she'd experienced. If powerful people thought they could silence an old cowboy and then intimidate his heir into giving up what he'd protected for 30 years, they were about to discover that they'd seriously underestimated the stubbornness of a young woman who'd spent her entire life refusing to back down from fights she wasn't supposed to win. But first, she needed allies. Sam's research had identified several scientists and researchers who'd been investigating similar phenomena. People who'd paid professional prices for their curiosity, but who remained committed to uncovering the truth. Maya spent her evenings composing careful emails to these individuals, sharing enough information to demonstrate that she possessed something significant, while withholding details that could put them or her in danger.
"Well, Dr. Whitmore," she said, allowing a note of steel to enter her voice, "I appreciate your concern for archaeological preservation, but as I said, this is a working cattle ranch. If I stumble across any arrowheads or pottery shards, I'll be sure to contact the appropriate authorities through proper channels." The emphasis she placed on proper channels wasn't lost on Whitmore. His expression hardened further, and Maya became acutely aware of the other 7 men who'd spread out around the barnyard, their positions chosen to block potential escape routes while maintaining the pretense of casual conversation. "Miss Delgado," Whitmore said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "I think there may be some misunderstanding here. We know that Samuel McKinnon was conducting unauthorized excavations on this property for several decades. We know that he discovered something significant, something that requires immediate professional attention. And we know that whatever he found is now your responsibility." Maya felt her mouth go dry, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with Whitmore. Mr. McKinnon was a cattle rancher, just like I am. If he'd found something significant, don't you think he would have reported it to the proper authorities? Perhaps he intended to, but death has a way of interrupting even the best intentions. Fortunately, we're here now to help you fulfill those intentions on his behalf. The threat was barely veiled now, and Maya realized that she was dealing with people who'd moved far beyond offering bribes or making polite requests.
These men had come to her ranch with the expectation that she would hand over Sam's discovery, and they weren't prepared to leave empty-handed. "Gentlemen," she said, loud enough for all of them to hear, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave my property. This is private land, and you're trespassing." Whitmore's laugh was cold and humorless. "Miss Delgado, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. We're not here to negotiate or make requests. We're here to collect materials that pose a significant threat to public understanding of American prehistory. Your cooperation would be appreciated, but it's not strictly necessary." Maya's hand moved instinctively toward the radio clipped to her belt, the one she used to communicate with neighboring ranchers and emergency services. But before she could reach it, one of Whitmore's companions stepped forward, his movement smooth and threatening. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the man said quietly. "Dr. Whitmore is trying to handle this situation diplomatically. It would be unfortunate if circumstances forced us to become less diplomatic." The implications were crystal clear. Maya was alone on 8,000 acres of isolated rangeland, facing 8 men who'd made it obvious they were willing to use force to get what they wanted. Her nearest neighbors were miles away, and even if she could call for help, local law enforcement would be vastly outgunned by people who clearly had resources and authorization that extended far beyond anything Deputy Martinez could handle. But Maya had learned long ago that backing down from intimidation only encouraged bullies to escalate their tactics. If she showed weakness now, these people would know they could push her around indefinitely. Her only chance was to project strength she didn't feel, and hope they weren't quite ready to cross the line from threats to actual violence. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins, "I think you've made a mistake. You've assumed that I'm some frightened little girl who'll hand over her inheritance because a bunch of men in suits show up and make vague threats. But I've been taking care of myself for a long time, and I've dealt with bullies before." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled group, making eye contact with each man in turn. "This conversation is over. You have 30 seconds to get back in your vehicles and leave my property. After that, I'm calling the sheriff's department and reporting a home invasion." Whitmore's mask slipped completely now, revealing the cold calculation beneath his academic facade. "Miss Delgado, you're making a very serious mistake. The forces we represent have resources you can't imagine. We can make your life extremely difficult in ways you won't see coming. Bank loans will be denied, insurance policies will be canceled, government inspections will find violations that require expensive corrections. Your cattle will develop mysterious illnesses, your equipment will malfunction, your neighbors will discover reasons to file lawsuits against you."
The litany of threats was delivered in the same calm, professional tone he might use to discuss research methodology, but Maya felt each word like a physical blow. These people had clearly destroyed other lives using exactly these tactics, turning the complex machinery of modern society into a weapon against anyone who stood in their way. "And if those subtle approaches don't work," Whitmore continued, "accidents happen on ranches all the time. Equipment failures, animal attacks, falls from horses, so many ways a young woman living alone could find herself in serious trouble with no one around to help." Maya's fear transformed into fury, so intense it surprised her with its purity. These bastards weren't just threatening her livelihood or her discovery. They were threatening her life,
just as they'd probably threatened Sam in the weeks before his death. The realization that they'd likely killed the closest thing to a father she'd ever known filled her with a rage that burned away her caution and left only the primal determination to fight back. "Get off my land," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying enough venom to make Whitmore take a step backward. "Get off my land right now, or I swear to God I'll make you regret every threat you just made." For a moment, the standoff hung in the balance. Maya could see calculations running behind Whitmore's eyes as he weighed the costs and benefits of escalating the situation. She was one woman against 8 men, isolated and vulnerable, but something in her expression must have suggested that pushing her further might be more dangerous than prudent. "Very well, Ms. Delgado. We'll leave. But this conversation isn't over. You have something that doesn't belong to us, and sooner or later you're going to give it to us. The only question is whether you do it voluntarily or whether circumstances force our hand." The men retreated to their vehicles with the same coordinated precision they'd shown in arriving, but Maya could feel their eyes on her as they drove away. She stood in the barnyard long after the dust from their departure had settled, her hands shaking with adrenaline and the delayed reaction to mortal fear. They knew about the skeleton. They knew exactly what Sam had discovered, and they were prepared to kill for it if necessary. Maya realized that she'd just declared war on forces with resources and capabilities she could barely comprehend. People who'd been eliminating obstacles to their agenda for decades. But she'd also learned something important about herself in those terrifying minutes of confrontation. When pushed to the absolute limit, when faced with threats that would have sent most people running for cover, she'd found the strength to stand her ground. The scared 16-year-old who'd hidden in Sam's barn all those years ago was gone, replaced by a woman who'd learned that sometimes the only way to survive was to fight back. Maya walked to the locked barn with a new purpose, her mind already racing ahead to the next phase of her struggle. If Whitmore and his consortium thought they could intimidate her into surrendering Sam's discovery, they'd seriously underestimated the stubbornness of someone who'd spent her entire life refusing to know her place. Inside the barn, the giant skeleton seemed to glow with its own inner light. 15,000 years of hidden history waiting to be revealed to a world that had been deliberately kept ignorant of its own past. Maya approached the ancient bones with something approaching reverence, her fingertips tracing the air above the massive skull without quite touching the fossilized surface. "I don't know what you were. I don't know how you lived or why you died, or what your people accomplished in the thousands of years before recorded history began. But I promise you this, your story is going to be told. Whatever it costs me, whoever tries to stop me, the world is going to learn that you existed." She spent the next hour photographing the skeleton from every conceivable angle, using the high-resolution camera Sam had left with his equipment. If something happened to the physical remains, at least there would be documentation that couldn't be suppressed or destroyed. She uploaded the images to encrypted cloud storage accounts, created backup files on multiple devices, and began composing detailed emails to every legitimate scientist she could identify who might be willing to risk their careers for the sake of truth. But even as she worked to protect the discovery, Maya knew that documentation alone wouldn't be enough. Whitmore's people could discredit photographs as elaborate hoaxes, could dismiss her as an unqualified amateur seeking attention or profit. What she needed was independent verification from established scientists, carbon dating results from multiple laboratories, peer-reviewed analysis that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed. The problem was that any attempt to involve legitimate institutions would inevitably alert the same forces that had been suppressing similar discoveries for decades. Maya found herself caught in an impossible paradox. She needed academic credibility to protect her discovery, but seeking that credibility would expose the discovery to the very people who wanted to destroy it. As she pondered this dilemma, Maya's radio crackled to life with the voice of her neighbor, Frank Morrison. His tone was urgent, worried in a way that immediately got her attention. "Maya, you out there? We got a problem over at the Morrison spread. Cattle are getting sick, and Doc Henderson thinks it might be contagious. You need to check your herd right away." Maya's blood ran cold as she processed the implications. Mysterious cattle illness, starting at the ranch next door just hours after Whitmore's visit. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. These people worked fast, and they'd chosen their first retaliatory strike carefully. Sick cattle would force her to focus on immediate survival instead of long-term plans for revealing her discovery. Worse, if the illness spread to her herd, the economic devastation could force her to sell the ranch within months. She grabbed her medical kit and headed for the pastures, her mind racing through possibilities. Biological warfare was an extreme escalation, but it fit the pattern of subtle violence that Whitmore had described. Her cattle would sicken and die. Her neighbors would suffer financial losses that would turn them against her, and eventually the pressure would become unbearable. But as she reached the main pasture and began examining her livestock, she discovered something that made her smile grimly despite the circumstances. The cattle were healthy, alert, active, showing none of the symptoms Frank had described in his animals. Whatever pathogen Whitmore's people had introduced to the Morrison Ranch, they'd apparently assumed it would spread naturally to neighboring properties. They'd underestimated the precautions that Sam had taught her to take. The McKinnon Ranch had been operating under strict biosecurity protocols for years, with separate water sources, controlled access points, and quarantine procedures that would slow or prevent the spread of most livestock diseases. Sam had claimed the measures were just good ranching practice, but Maya now wondered if he'd been preparing for exactly this kind of attack. She spent the rest of the afternoon documenting the health of her cattle, collecting water samples from every source on the property, and implementing additional security measures that would make it even harder for outside agents to contaminate her livestock. If this was going to be a war of attrition, she intended to make it as expensive as possible for her enemies. But even as she worked to protect her ranch, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting a losing battle. Whitmore's organization had unlimited resources and decades of experience in destroying people who threatened their agenda. They could attack her from a dozen different directions simultaneously, wearing down her defenses until something inevitably broke through. Unless she changed the rules of the game entirely. That evening, as Maya sat in Sam's study reviewing his correspondence with researchers around the world, an idea began to form that was both terrifying and liberating in its audacity. Instead of trying to protect her secret while slowly building academic credibility, what if she did the opposite? What if she revealed everything at once, making the discovery so public and so widely documented that suppressing it would be impossible?
The internet had democratized information in ways that didn't exist when Sam had first discovered the skeleton 30 years ago. Social media, video platforms, citizen journalism. There were channels of communication that bypassed traditional gatekeepers entirely. If Maya could present her evidence convincingly enough, she might be able to create such a massive public response that even Whitmore's organization couldn't contain it. It would be an enormous gamble. Going public would make her a target for every debunker, skeptic, and conspiracy theorist on the planet. It would also eliminate any possibility of working with established institutions, burning bridges she might need later. And if she failed to convince the public, if her revelation was dismissed as an elaborate hoax, she'd lose any chance of eventual academic vindication.
But the alternative was to wait passively while her enemies destroyed her piece by piece, using tactics that had worked against dozens of other people who'd tried to reveal similar truths. At least by going public, she'd be fighting on her own terms, using weapons they weren't prepared to counter. Maya opened her laptop and began composing the most important document of her life, a comprehensive presentation that would introduce the world to the giant skeleton hidden in her barn and challenge everything humanity thought it knew about its own prehistory. If she was going to declare war on the forces that had killed Sam McKinnon and threatened to destroy her, she might as well make it a war worth fighting. The battle for truth was about to begin, and Maya Delgado intended to fire the first shot. Maya spent 3 sleepless days preparing for what she privately called the revelation. Working 18-hour stretches in Sam's converted laboratory, she meticulously documented every aspect of the giant skeleton, creating a multimedia presentation that would be impossible to dismiss as amateur enthusiasm or elaborate hoax. High-resolution photographs captured every detail of the ancient bones, from the massive skull's distinctive features to the tool marks on several ribs that suggested the creature had been deliberately buried with ceremonial care. She filmed herself taking precise measurements, demonstrating the skeleton's proportions against her own 5'6" frame to provide a scale that would shock viewers into understanding the true magnitude of what she'd discovered. The creature had stood nearly 12 feet tall, with bone density and muscle attachment points that spoke of incredible physical strength. Yet the skull's capacity and structure suggested intelligence that matched or exceeded modern humans, challenging every assumption about the relationship between brain size and cognitive ability. But Maya knew that visual evidence alone wouldn't be enough to convince a skeptical world. She needed scientific credibility, independent verification from sources that couldn't be dismissed as biased or incompetent. Working from Sam's extensive correspondence files, she reached out to Dr. Sarah Chen at UC Berkeley, Dr. Michael Brennan in Denver, and half a dozen other researchers who'd been marginalized for pursuing similar investigations. The responses came back faster than she'd expected, each more urgent than the last. Dr. Chen agreed to drive out from California immediately, canceling her classes and risking further damage to her already precarious academic standing. Dr. Brennan chartered a private plane from Colorado, bringing portable carbon dating equipment and a team of graduate students who'd been secretly documenting suppressed archaeological discoveries for years. Within 48 hours, Maya's isolated ranch had been transformed into a clandestine research facility. Scientists worked around the clock in the converted barn, taking bone samples for analysis, creating detailed 3D scans of the skeleton, and comparing their findings with similar discoveries that had been hidden away in private collections around the world. The results exceeded even Maya's most optimistic expectations. Carbon dating confirmed the skeleton's age at approximately 14,800 years, placing it firmly in the prehistoric period before known human civilization in North America. Bone density analysis revealed a creature adapted for tremendous physical exertion, suggesting a lifestyle that required strength and endurance far beyond anything in the modern human range. Most significantly, cranial measurements indicated a brain volume nearly 40% larger than typical modern humans, with structural features that implied advanced cognitive processing abilities. Dr. Chen was practically vibrating with excitement as she compiled the preliminary findings. "Maya, do you understand what this means? This isn't just a tall human or a genetic anomaly. This appears to be evidence of a completely separate branch of human evolution, a species that developed in parallel with our ancestors, but along radically different lines. The implications for our understanding of prehistoric America, of human development, of everything we thought we knew about our species' history, it's revolutionary.
But it was Dr. Brannon who provided the context that made Maya's blood run cold. As the team worked to document their findings, he pulled her aside for a conversation that confirmed her worst fears about the forces arrayed against them. "I've been tracking suppression efforts for 20 years, he told her, his voice grim with experience. "What you've discovered here isn't unique, it's just the most complete example we've ever had access to. There have been dozens of similar finds across the American West, all of them disappeared or discredited by the same network of institutions. They call themselves different names: archaeological consortiums, historical preservation societies, research foundations, but they're all tentacles of the same beast." He showed her files documenting a pattern of suppression that stretched back over a century. Giant skeletons discovered by miners in Nevada, photographed and documented, then mysteriously lost when Smithsonian representatives came to collect them. Archaeological sites in Arizona that yielded massive human remains, only to be declared off-limits by government agencies citing national security concerns. University researchers who'd attempted to study such discoveries, finding their funding cut and their careers destroyed by whisper campaigns that portrayed them as pseudoscientists chasing fantasies. "The question," Dr. Brennan continued, "is why they're so determined to keep this information hidden. What's so threatening about evidence of prehistoric giants that powerful people will kill to suppress it?" Maya had been pondering the same question during her long nights in the laboratory, and she'd begun to form theories that made her uncomfortable with their implications. The existence of an advanced prehistoric civilization in North America would challenge fundamental assumptions about human development, about the superiority of modern technology, about the very nature of progress itself. It would suggest that humanity had achieved great things before, then lost that knowledge in some cataclysmic event that reset our species' development. More troubling still, it would raise questions about what other knowledge had been suppressed, what other discoveries had been hidden away to protect established narratives about human history. If prehistoric giants had been deliberately erased from the archaeological record, what else had been covered up? What other truths had been deemed too dangerous for public consumption? But Maya's philosophical speculation was interrupted by more immediate concerns. Dr. Chen's equipment had detected electronic surveillance devices planted around the ranch perimeter. Sophisticated gear that was monitoring their communications and documenting their activities. Whitmore's organization was watching everything they did, preparing their next move in what was clearly an escalating conflict. "We need to go public immediately," Dr. Chen urged in an emergency meeting in the barn. "Every hour we delay gives them more time to prepare countermeasures. Once this information is out there, broadly distributed and independently verified, it becomes much harder to suppress." Maya nodded, her mind already racing ahead to the logistics of revelation. She'd spent the past week creating multiple backup plans, establishing secure communication channels, and building a network of sympathetic journalists and citizen researchers who could help amplify her message. The time for caution and gradual disclosure had passed. If she was going to fight these people, she needed to do it on her own terms, using weapons they weren't prepared to counter. She began with a live-streamed video from the laboratory, speaking directly to the camera as the giant skeleton loomed behind her in all its prehistoric majesty. Maya had never been comfortable with public speaking, but the gravity of the moment burned away her self-consciousness and left only the urgent need to share what she'd discovered.
My name is Maya Delgado. 3 weeks ago, I inherited a cattle ranch in Montana from a man who was more of a father to me than my own blood relatives ever were. I thought Samuel McKinnon had left me land and livestock and the chance to build a life for myself in one of the most beautiful places on earth. She paused, letting the camera pan across the laboratory equipment and research materials that filled the converted barn. What I actually inherited was the most important archaeological discovery in human history, and the responsibility to protect it from forces that have been suppressing similar finds for over a century.
Maya gestured toward the skeleton, her hand trembling slightly as she pointed to the massive skull that dominated the frame. This creature lived and died approximately 15,000 years ago, thousands of years before human civilization in North America. It stood nearly 12 feet tall, possessed physical strength that would have made it capable of incredible feats of construction and engineering, and had a brain 40% larger than modern humans. The implications hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Maya continued, her voice gaining strength as she shared the documentation that supported her claims. Over the past week, this discovery has been independently verified by multiple scientists using equipment and techniques that meet the highest standards of archaeological research. Carbon dating from 3 separate laboratories confirms the skeleton's age. Bone density analysis reveals adaptations for tremendous physical capability. Cranial measurements indicate cognitive capacity that challenges our assumptions about the relationship between brain size and intelligence. She walked around the skeleton as she spoke, the camera capturing every detail of the ancient bones. But this discovery is significant for more than just its scientific implications. This skeleton represents evidence of systematic suppression that has hidden humanity's true history for generations. My research has documented dozens of similar finds that have been disappeared, discredited, or destroyed by institutions claiming to represent scientific objectivity while actually serving hidden agendas. Maya's voice hardened as she described the threats she'd received, the intimidation tactics, the mysterious cattle illnesses that had struck neighboring ranches immediately after her confrontation with Whitmer's people. She named names, provided documentation, and challenged the organizations responsible to explain their actions in public forums where their evasions could be exposed and criticized. I'm releasing this information not because I seek fame or fortune, but because the truth belongs to everyone. Humanity has a right to know its own history, to understand the full scope of what our species has accomplished and lost over the millennia. No organization, no matter how powerful or well-connected, has the authority to decide what knowledge the public is allowed to access. The video went live simultaneously across multiple platforms: YouTube, Vimeo, BitChute, and half a dozen smaller services that specialized in controversial content. Maya had learned from Sam's research that diversification was key to avoiding suppression. By the time censors could shut down one platform, the content would have spread to dozens of others. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the video had been viewed millions of times, shared across social media platforms, and picked up by news outlets around the world. Comment sections exploded with debate, speculation, and demands for additional evidence. Citizen journalists began investigating Maya's claims independently, cross-referencing her documentation with their own research into suppressed archaeological discoveries. But the most significant response came from unexpected quarters. Professional archaeologists and anthropologists who'd remained silent about their own encounters with suppressed evidence began coming forward,
sharing their stories in video responses and written testimonials. Dr. Patricia Williams from the University of Arizona revealed that she'd been forced to abandon her career after discovering similar skeletal remains in the 1990s. Dr. James Morrison from the Museum of Natural History in New York admitted that he'd personally witnessed the removal and destruction of giant skeletons that contradicted official historical narratives. The dam of silence that had protected the suppression network for decades was beginning to crack, and Maya found herself at the center of a growing movement of researchers who'd decided that the truth was more important than their careers or personal safety. Dr. Chen established a secure communication network that allowed verified scientists to share suppressed evidence without exposing themselves to immediate retaliation. Dr. Brennan began publishing detailed documentation of the suppression network's activities, naming specific individuals and organizations that had been involved in covering up archaeological discoveries. Maya's ranch became an informal headquarters for what was rapidly evolving into a full-scale scientific rebellion.
But the forces they were challenging didn't remain passive in the face of this uprising. Within days of Maya's initial revelation, a coordinated counterattack began that demonstrated the true reach and sophistication of the suppression network. Debunking websites appeared overnight, complete with detailed analyses that portrayed Maya's skeleton as an elaborate hoax created using readily available materials and special effects techniques. The sites featured testimonials from supposed experts who dismissed the carbon dating results as contaminated or falsified, the bone analysis as misinterpreted, and the documentation as cleverly manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. Major news outlets that had initially covered Maya's story began running follow-up pieces that emphasized the skeptical perspective, interviewing established archaeologists who questioned the validity of her claims and suggested that the scientific community should wait for peer-reviewed analysis before drawing any conclusions. The tone of coverage shifted from breathless excitement about a revolutionary discovery to cautious skepticism about sensational claims that challenged established knowledge. More troubling still, Maya began receiving reports from her newly allied scientists that they were facing coordinated pressure designed to force them back into silence. Research grants were being withdrawn, university positions were being terminated for vague infractions of academic policy, and professional associations were launching ethics investigations that threatened to destroy careers built over decades of legitimate work. Dr. Chen called Maya in a state of barely controlled panic to report that UC Berkeley had placed her on administrative leave pending an investigation into inappropriate use of university resources for unauthorized research activities. Dr. Brennan's museum consulting contracts had been canceled en masse, leaving him without income and facing the prospect of bankruptcy. Even Maya's supporters in the citizen journalism community were finding their platforms restricted, their accounts suspended, and their content flagged for violating terms of service that seemed to be applied selectively. The message was clear. The revelation of truth came with consequences that extended far beyond the individual making the revelation. Anyone who supported Maya's claims, anyone who helped amplify her message, anyone who contributed to the growing body of evidence supporting her discovery would face systematic destruction of their livelihood and reputation. But for every scientist who is silenced, two more seem to emerge from the shadows with their own evidence and their own stories of suppression. The network effect that Maya had hoped to create was working, building momentum that became harder to contain with each passing day. International researchers began sharing similar discoveries from their own countries, suggesting that the phenomenon of prehistoric giants wasn't limited to North America, but might represent a global pattern of human development that had been systematically erased from official history. The breakthrough came when Dr. Elena Volkov, a prominent Russian archaeologist, published a paper documenting giant skeletal remains discovered in Siberia that matched Maya's findings almost exactly. The Russian government, perhaps seeing an opportunity to embarrass Western scientific institutions, provided official support for Dr. Volkov's research and called for international investigation into what they termed the deliberate falsification of human prehistory by American and European academic establishments. Suddenly, Maya's discovery wasn't just a scientific controversy. It was becoming a geopolitical issue that threatened to expose decades of collaborative suppression efforts between governments and academic institutions. The stakes had escalated far beyond what any of the original participants had anticipated, transforming a conflict over archaeological evidence into a crisis that threatened to undermine public trust in scientific authority itself. Maya watched these developments from her ranch with a mixture of exhilaration and terror. She'd succeeded in making her discovery impossible to suppress completely, but she'd also created a situation that was spiraling beyond her control. The forces she had challenged were revealing the true extent of their power and ruthlessness, demonstrating that they were prepared to destroy not just individuals, but entire scientific careers to protect their secrets. But there was no going back now. The giant skeleton in her barn had become a symbol of hidden truth, a rallying point for everyone who believed that knowledge belonged to humanity rather than to the powerful institutions that claimed to guard it. Maya had lit a fuse that was burning its way toward an explosion that would reshape how the world understood its own past, and all she could do was hold on and hope that the truth would prove stronger than the forces trying to suppress it.
As she stood in the laboratory late one evening, surrounded by equipment and documentation that represented the most important work of her life, Maya felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. 15,000 years ago, the creatures whose bones stood before her had lived and died under the same Montana sky, part of a civilization that had been erased so completely that most people refused to believe it had ever existed. Now, thanks to an old cowboy's faith in a runaway girl and her determination to honor his trust, that ancient being's story was finally being told. Whatever happened next, whatever forces arrayed themselves against her, Maya knew that she'd kept her promise to both Sam McKinnon and the giant whose bones had waited millennia for someone brave enough to reveal their secrets to the world. The revelation was complete, but the real battle was just beginning. The war for truth reached its crescendo on a cold November morning when Maya awoke to find her ranch surrounded by a small army of vehicles. But unlike Whitmore's intimidating convoy of black SUVs, this gathering represented something entirely different. A pilgrimage of scientists, journalists, documentary filmmakers, and ordinary citizens who traveled from around the world to witness the giant skeleton that had become the center of a global controversy. 6 weeks had passed since Maya's initial revelation. 6 weeks that had transformed her from an unknown ranch hand into the most famous and controversial figure in modern archaeology. The giant skeleton story had taken on a life of its own, spreading across social media platforms and news outlets with viral intensity that even the most sophisticated suppression efforts couldn't contain. Maya's ranch had become ground zero for a movement that challenged not just archaeological orthodoxy, but the very foundations of how knowledge was controlled and distributed in the modern world. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from one of the research trailers that now dotted the ranch property, her face exhausted but triumphant. "Maya, you need to see the latest results from the Beijing laboratory. The Chinese analysis confirms everything we've documented. Bone age, genetic markers, even isotope signatures that indicate this creature's diet included megafauna that went extinct at the end of the last ice age. Maya nodded, though the constant stream of validating evidence had begun to feel almost anticlimactic. Each new confirmation simply added another layer to a story that had already fundamentally altered how humanity understood its prehistoric past. What mattered now wasn't proving the skeleton's authenticity. That battle had been won through sheer weight of independent verification. What mattered was preserving that victory against forces that were growing increasingly desperate to contain the damage. The suppression network that Dr. Whitmore represented shifted tactics as their traditional methods proved inadequate to the challenge. Instead of trying to discredit Maya's discovery directly, they'd begun a campaign of character assassination designed to undermine her credibility as a person. Social media platforms were flooded with posts portraying her as mentally unstable, financially motivated, or secretly funded by foreign governments seeking to embarrass American scientific institutions. Anonymous sources provided tabloid newspapers with supposed details about Maya's troubled childhood, her time in foster care, and her desperate need for attention and validation. Professional genealogists appeared out of nowhere to question her claimed Native American heritage, suggesting she was exploiting indigenous identity for personal gain. Financial investigators examined her ranch's ownership records, hunting for evidence of mysterious funding sources that might explain how an uneducated ranch hand could afford sophisticated scientific equipment. But Maya had learned valuable lessons about information warfare from Sam's research files, and she'd prepared countermeasures that turned many of these attacks back on their perpetrators. Working with a team of investigative journalists who joined her cause, she began exposing the funding sources behind the smear campaign, tracing payment records that connected anonymous social media accounts to shell companies that ultimately led back to the same institutions that had been suppressing archaeological evidence for decades.
Dr. Whitmore himself became a target of the exposure campaign when financial records revealed that his North American Archaeological Consortium was funded primarily by defense contractors and energy companies with interests in controlling access to federal lands where similar discoveries might be made. His academic credentials came under scrutiny, revealing a pattern of publications that consistently dismissed or debunked findings that challenged established historical narratives. Maya watched the dismantling of the suppression network with grim satisfaction, but she took little pleasure in the destruction of individual careers and reputations. These people had devoted their lives to maintaining what they believed was necessary order in humanity's understanding of its past. They genuinely believed that some truths were too dangerous for public consumption, that ordinary people couldn't be trusted with knowledge that might undermine social stability or challenge fundamental assumptions about progress and civilization. In quiet moments, often late at night, when the ranch was finally peaceful and she could think clearly, Maya found herself wondering if they might be partially right. The revelation of prehistoric giants had indeed challenged people's understanding of human development, creating space for theories and speculation that ranged from legitimate scientific inquiry to wild conspiracy theorizing. Religious fundamentalists claimed the skeleton proved biblical accounts of Nephilim and fallen angels. New Age spiritualists saw evidence of ancient alien visitation or lost Atlantean civilizations. Pseudoscientists used Maya's discovery to promote their own fringe theories about everything from hollow Earth hypotheses to time-traveling visitors from the future. The democratization of information that had made Maya's revelation possible also meant that truth and fiction, legitimate research and wild speculation,
credible evidence, and manufactured controversy all existed in the same informational ecosystem. Maya had given the world access to hidden knowledge, but she couldn't control how that knowledge was interpreted or used. Dr. Elena Volkov arrived from Russia in late November, bringing with her additional skeletal remains that Russian archaeologists had excavated from sites in Siberia. The international dimension of the discovery had transformed what began as an American controversy into a global phenomenon that transcended national boundaries and political systems. Volkov's presence at the ranch represented official recognition from at least one major government that the giant skeleton phenomenon was legitimate and worthy of serious scientific investigation. Working together in the converted laboratory, Maya and Volkov compared skeletal remains that had been separated by thousands of miles and possibly thousands of years, finding similarities that suggested prehistoric giants had represented not just isolated anomalies, but entire populations that had once thrived across the northern hemisphere. The implications were staggering. An advanced prehistoric civilization that had spanned continents, possessed technology and knowledge that had been lost to subsequent human development, and had disappeared so completely that only scattered skeletal remains testified to their existence. This changes everything we thought we knew about human development, Volkov told Maya as they documented structural similarities between the Montana and Siberian skeletons. These creatures weren't just physically larger than modern humans, they represent an entirely different evolutionary path, one that emphasized different adaptations and capabilities than our own ancestral line. Maya found herself thinking about the tool marks on several of the skeleton's ribs, evidence that the creature had been deliberately buried with ceremonial care by companions who understood death as something more than just mere biological cessation. These beings possessed not just intelligence and technology, but culture, spirituality, and social structures sophisticated enough to honor their dead with complex funeral practices. What had happened to them? How had such an advanced civilization disappeared so completely that only hidden skeletal remains provided evidence of their existence? Maya's research into Sam's files suggested several possibilities, none of them comforting. Climate change at the end of the last ice age might have destroyed their environmental niche. Warfare with competing human populations might have led to genocide that erased their genetic lineage. Disease, natural disasters, or simple demographic collapse might have reduced their numbers below sustainable levels.
Or perhaps, Maya thought, with a chill that had nothing to do with Montana's approaching winter, they hadn't disappeared naturally at all. Perhaps they'd been deliberately eliminated by ancestors of modern humans who saw them as competitors or threats. Perhaps the suppression of evidence about prehistoric giants wasn't just about controlling historical narratives. Perhaps it was about hiding the greatest crime in human history. The philosophical implications of these possibilities weighed heavily on Maya's mind as she prepared for what everyone understood would be the climactic confrontation in her war with the suppression network. Federal agencies had announced their intention to investigate the ranch for potential violations of laws governing archaeological discoveries on private property. The stated purpose was to ensure that important historical artifacts were being properly preserved and studied. But everyone involved understood that the real goal was to seize control of the skeleton and remove it from Maya's independent custody. Maya had been preparing for this moment since her first confrontation with Dr. Whitmore. Working with constitutional lawyers who specialized in property rights cases,
She'd built a legal defense based on the principle that discoveries made on private property belonged to the landowners rather than to government agencies or academic institutions. The case would ultimately be decided by federal courts, but Maya intended to fight every step of the legal process while continuing to share her discoveries with the global scientific community. The morning of the federal intervention dawned clear and cold, with early snow dusting the peaks of the distant mountains. Maya stood in the barnyard watching government vehicles approach, feeling remarkably calm despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. She'd done everything possible to protect her discovery and share its implications with the world. Whatever happened next was beyond her individual control. Agent Patricia Sullivan, the federal investigator leading the intervention, approached Maya with professional courtesy that couldn't quite mask the awkwardness of the situation. Sullivan was a career law enforcement officer who'd built her reputation on straightforward cases involving artifact smuggling and theft of cultural heritage materials. Maya's situation presented legal and scientific complexities that fell well outside normal investigative parameters. "Miss Delgado," she said, extending her hand in greeting, "I want you to know that we're here to ensure proper preservation and study of any archaeological materials on your property. This isn't an adversarial action. We're simply following established protocols for significant discoveries." Maya shook the agent's hand, noting the firmness of her grip and the direct eye contact that suggested genuine respect, despite their opposing positions. "Agent Sullivan, I appreciate your professionalism, but I think we both know this isn't really about archaeological protocols. This is about who controls access to knowledge that challenges established narratives about human history." Sullivan's expression didn't change, but Maya caught a flicker of something, uncertainty, perhaps, or recognition that the young woman she was investigating might understand the situation better than anyone had expected. "Regardless of the broader implications," she replied carefully, "I have a job to do. Federal law requires that significant archaeological discoveries be reported to appropriate authorities and made available for professional study. I need to examine the materials you've been researching and determine whether they fall under federal jurisdiction." Maya nodded and led the federal team toward the laboratory where Dr. Chen and Dr. Volkov waited beside the giant skeleton. The atmosphere in the barn was tense but dignified, like a funeral where everyone understood the importance of the proceedings, even if they disagreed about their necessity. Sullivan and her team spent several hours documenting the skeleton, taking their own photographs and measurements, and reviewing the extensive research files that Maya and her collaborators had compiled. Maya watched the federal investigators' work, noting their obvious competence and professionalism, but also their growing amazement as they encountered evidence that exceeded anything they had been prepared to find. "Miss Delgado," Sullivan said finally, her voice carefully neutral, "this is clearly a significant archaeological discovery that warrants professional study. However, I have to note that the quality of documentation and analysis you've already completed exceeds what we typically see from private individuals. Your research methodology appears to meet professional standards." It was as close to an admission of legitimacy as Maya was likely to receive from a federal agent, and she appreciated Sullivan's professional integrity in acknowledging the quality of work that had been done.
"Agent Sullivan," Maya replied, "I've never claimed to be a professional archaeologist, but I've had excellent teachers, and I've learned that important discoveries deserve careful, honest investigation regardless of who makes them.
This skeleton has waited 15,000 years to tell its story. I've tried to ensure that story is told accurately and completely. The negotiations that followed established a compromise that neither side found entirely satisfactory, but that both could accept as workable. The skeleton would remain on Maya's property under joint custody arrangements that allowed continued independent research while also satisfying federal requirements for professional oversight. Maya would retain ownership and primary control of the discovery, but would work with a coalition of international researchers to ensure that the skeleton received the broadest possible scientific investigation. Most importantly, the agreement established legal precedents that would protect future discoveries from automatic seizure by government agencies. Private landowners who made significant archaeological finds would have rights and protections that hadn't existed before Maya's case forced the courts to address these issues directly. As the federal team prepared to leave, Agent Sullivan approached Maya for a private conversation that revealed the personal impact of what they'd all witnessed. "Ms. Delgado," Agent Sullivan said quietly, "I've been investigating archaeological crimes for 15 years. I've seen a lot of artifacts, a lot of discoveries, a lot of people who claim to have found something revolutionary. This is different. What you've discovered here, what you've documented and shared with the world, it really does change everything we thought we knew about human history." Maya felt tears prick her eyes at the simple acknowledgement from someone whose professional judgment she'd come to respect. "Agent Sullivan, 3 months ago, I was just a ranch hand who inherited more than she knew how to handle. I still don't know if I'm the right person to be responsible for something this important. But I know Sam McKinnon believed I could learn, and I know the truth deserves to be told regardless of how uncomfortable it makes people." Sullivan nodded, her expression thoughtful. "For what it's worth, I think your benefactor chose well. You handled an impossible situation with more grace and integrity than most people could manage. The scientific community, the legitimate scientific community, is going to be debating the implications of your discovery for decades to come." After the federal team departed, Maya stood alone in the laboratory with the giant skeleton that had transformed her life in ways she was still trying to understand. The ancient bones seemed to glow in the LED lighting. 15,000 years of hidden history finally exposed to the light of modern inquiry. She thought about Sam McKinnon, about his faith in her ability to protect and share what he'd discovered, about the responsibility she'd inherited along with the ranch. The battle for truth had been won, but the war for understanding was just beginning. Maya's revelation had opened doors that could never be closed again, creating space for new questions and new discoveries that would reshape humanity's understanding of its own development. Archaeological sites around the world were being re-examined with fresh eyes, looking for evidence of prehistoric giants that might have been overlooked or misinterpreted by earlier investigators operating under different assumptions. Universities were establishing new research programs dedicated to investigating anomalous skeletal remains and challenging established timelines of human development. International collaborations were forming to share information and coordinate investigations across national boundaries. Most importantly, the principles of open access and independent verification that Maya had championed were becoming standard practices that would make future suppression efforts much more difficult to sustain.
But perhaps the most significant change was less tangible but more profound. A shift in public consciousness that recognized the importance of protecting knowledge from institutional control.
Maya's story had demonstrated that truth could emerge from unexpected sources, that important discoveries didn't require official approval to be valid, and that ordinary people had both the right and the responsibility to challenge authority when it tried to hide knowledge that belonged to everyone. As Maya walked back toward the main house in the gathering darkness, she felt the weight of Sam's legacy settling onto her shoulders, not as a burden, but as a source of strength. She'd honored his trust, protected his discovery, and ensured that the truth about humanity's hidden past would never again be buried in institutional silence. The giant skeleton would continue to inspire research and debate for generations to come, but its most important contribution had already been made. It had proven that secrets couldn't be kept forever, that truth had a way of emerging despite the most sophisticated efforts to suppress it, and that sometimes the most important discoveries were made not by credentialed experts, but by ordinary people who refused to accept that some knowledge was too dangerous for the world to know. Maya McKinnon. She'd legally changed her name to honor the man who'd given her everything, was no longer just the inheritor of a cattle ranch. She was the guardian of humanity's hidden history, the protector of truths that had been deliberately erased, and the living proof that courage and determination could overcome even the most powerful forces of suppression and control. The Montana sky stretched endlessly above her ranch, filled with stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the emergence and extinction of entire species, the endless cycle of discovery and loss that defined the human experience. Under that same sky, 15,000 years ago, giants walked the earth and built civilizations whose achievements had been forgotten by everyone except one stubborn old cowboy and the young woman he'd chosen to carry on his work. Their story was finally being told, and Maya intended to make sure it would never be forgotten again. The morning sun painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and amber as Dr. Maya McKinnon walked across the courtyard of what had once been a simple cattle ranch and was now the McKinnon Institute for Prehistoric Studies, the world's first independent research facility dedicated to investigating suppressed archaeological discoveries. The giant skeleton, now officially designated as McKinnon 1 in scientific literature, stood in a climate-controlled exhibition hall that had been built around Sam's original laboratory. Millions of visitors had made the pilgrimage to rural Montana to see the remains that had sparked a revolution in archaeological thinking. But Maya still felt a thrill of wonder every time she entered the hall and found herself face to face with the ancient being that had changed her life so completely. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the new genetics laboratory, her face animated with the excitement that had become her trademark since joining the Institute as its first director of molecular archaeology. The methodical investigation of McKinnon 1 had yielded discoveries that continued to challenge fundamental assumptions about human development and prehistoric civilization. Maya, you need to see the latest results from the DNA sequencing project, Chen said, holding up a tablet display filled with complex genetic analysis charts. We finally isolated enough viable genetic material to create a comprehensive profile of our giant friend, and the results are absolutely extraordinary. Maya followed Chen into the genetics laboratory, a facility that would have been unimaginable 5 years ago when she was struggling to understand the basics of archaeological preservation. The Institute now employed over 200 researchers from dozens of countries, all united by their commitment to investigating anomalous discoveries that mainstream institutions had ignored or suppressed.
The genetic analysis confirms what we've suspected about the relationship between McKinnon 1 and modern humans, Chen continued, pulling up detailed chromosome comparisons on the lab's main display screen. There's clear evidence of common ancestry, but the giant lineage diverged from our evolutionary path much earlier than we initially estimated, possibly as far back as 200,000 years ago. Maya studied the genetic charts, Dr. Chen patiently explaining what the complex data meant. She'd completed correspondence courses in archaeology, anthropology, and genetics, earning degrees that legitimized her role as the Institute's director, while never forgetting that her most important qualification was simply her refusal to let the truth be buried. "What's the implication for the timeline of human development?" Maya asked, though she suspected she knew the answer would challenge yet another established assumption about humanity's prehistoric journey. If these results are accurate, it means that multiple human species were developing in parallel for hundreds of thousands of years. The giants weren't just physically different. They represent an entirely separate evolutionary experiment that achieved intelligence, technology, and civilization along pathways completely distinct from our own ancestral line. The implications were staggering, even after 5 years of similar revelations. McKinnon 1 had just been the beginning. The Institute's global network of researchers had identified and investigated dozens of similar discoveries, building a body of evidence that suggested prehistoric giants had once thrived across multiple continents. Archaeological sites in South America, Asia, and even Europe had yielded skeletal remains and artifacts that painted a picture of advanced prehistoric civilizations that had been systematically erased from official historical records. Maya walked through the Institute's main research facility, observing the work that had become her life's mission. In one laboratory, Dr. Elena Volkov led a team investigating tool marks found on giant bones from Siberian sites, evidence of sophisticated metalworking capabilities that predated known human metallurgy by thousands of years. In another wing, Dr. Michael Brennan supervised the digital reconstruction of giant settlement sites, using ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery to map the remains of structures that had been deliberately buried and forgotten. The Institute had also become a refuge for researchers who'd been marginalized or persecuted for investigating similar phenomena. Scientists who'd lost university positions, had their funding eliminated, or had their reputations destroyed for pursuing inconvenient truths, found new careers and renewed purpose in the Institute's collaborative environment. Maya took particular pride in providing a home for scholars who'd been silenced for refusing to compromise their intellectual integrity. But perhaps the most significant development had been the establishment of the Institute's legal advocacy program, which worked to protect the rights of private landowners who made important archaeological discoveries. Maya's successful defense against federal seizure had established precedents that were now being used by individuals around the world to resist institutional attempts to control or suppress their findings. The program was led by Rebecca Martinez, a constitutional lawyer who'd initially been hired to defend Maya's ownership rights, but had stayed to build a comprehensive legal framework for protecting archaeological discoveries from institutional suppression.
Martinez had become a close friend and advisor, helping Maya navigate the complex world of scientific politics and government relations that came with operating an independent research institution. "Maya, we need to discuss the situation in Peru," Martinez said, joining Maya in the courtyard outside the main research building. "The family that discovered the giant mummies in the Nazca region are facing government pressure to turn over their findings to the National University. They're citing your case as precedent for maintaining private ownership, but the political situation is getting complicated."
Maya nodded, unsurprised by the development. The Institute had documented similar discoveries on every continent, and in many cases, the researchers or landowners who'd made the discoveries faced the same institutional pressure that had nearly destroyed her own investigation. The success of the McKinnon Institute had inspired others to resist such pressure, but it had also intensified efforts by suppression networks to prevent similar independent research facilities from emerging. "What kind of support can we provide?" Maya asked. She'd learned that the battle for archaeological truth required not just scientific investigation, but also legal, political, and financial resources that most individual researchers couldn't access on their own. Legal consultation, scientific verification, and, if necessary, international media attention, Martinez replied. The Peruvian government is much more likely to respect private ownership rights if they know the international community is watching their actions. Maya approved the support package, adding it to a growing list of similar interventions around the world. The Institute had become more than just a research facility. It was the hub of a global movement that challenged institutional control over knowledge and supported independent investigation of suppressed discoveries. As she walked through the Institute's grounds, Maya reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning 5 years ago when she'd inherited what she thought was simply a cattle ranch. The scared young woman who'd hidden in Sam McKinnon's barn as a teenager had become one of the world's most respected advocates for archaeological truth. But the transformation hadn't been without costs. The constant pressure of operating under public scrutiny, the responsibility of protecting discoveries that could reshape human understanding of its own history, and the ongoing battle against forces that still sought to suppress inconvenient truths had taken their toll. Maya had aged beyond her years, developing the kind of steely determination that came from fighting battles that most people couldn't even imagine. But she'd also gained something that her younger self had never possessed: the absolute certainty that she was doing work that mattered. Every day brought new discoveries, new evidence of humanity's hidden past, and new opportunities to expand public understanding of the incredible journey that had brought the species to its current point of development. The Institute's visitor center had become a pilgrimage site for people who wanted to see physical evidence of humanity's suppressed history. Maya made it a point to spend time with visitors, particularly young people who reminded her of her own journey from ignorance to understanding. She'd established scholarship programs that brought promising students from around the world to study at the Institute, ensuring that the next generation of researchers would have the tools and support necessary to continue the work of revealing hidden truths. One of those students, a brilliant young woman named Anna Clearwater from the Crow Reservation, had become Maya's unofficial protege and designated successor. Anna combined traditional indigenous knowledge with cutting-edge scientific training, bringing perspectives that enriched the Institute's research in ways that Maya was still learning to appreciate. "Dr. McKinnon," Anna said, approaching Maya with the formal respect that she maintained despite their growing friendship, "the delegation from the Chinese Academy of Sciences has arrived for the joint research project.
They've brought skeletal remains from the Xinjiang sites that appeared to match our North American specimens almost exactly. Maya smiled at the news, though she was no longer surprised by evidence of the global scope of prehistoric giant societies. The Institute's research had documented similar skeletal remains and archaeological sites on every continent, suggesting that advanced human societies had once flourished worldwide before disappearing in ways that mainstream archaeology was only beginning to understand.
The Chinese collaboration represented a significant milestone in the Institute's evolution from a regional research facility to a global center for investigating suppressed archaeological discoveries. Government-sponsored researchers from multiple countries now worked alongside independent scientists to investigate phenomena that had been dismissed or ignored for generations. "Excellent," Maya replied. "Have Dr. Chen and Dr. Volkov been briefed on the Chinese findings? I want to make sure we're prepared for meaningful comparison analysis." Anna nodded. Her efficiency and attention to detail reminded Maya of her own younger self learning to manage responsibilities that had seemed overwhelming at the time. "Everything's arranged. Dr. Chen has already begun preliminary analysis of the genetic samples they brought, and Dr. Volkov is preparing the comparison protocols for the skeletal measurements." Maya felt a deep satisfaction as she watched Anna coordinate the complex logistics of international scientific collaboration. The Institute had become exactly what Sam McKinnon had envisioned when he chose to entrust his discovery to a young woman who'd proven she could learn whatever was necessary to protect and share important truths. That evening, Maya stood in the exhibition hall beside the giant skeleton that had started it all, thinking about the journey that had brought her from terrified inheritance recipient to confident leader of a global research movement. McKinnon 1 seemed to watch her with ancient wisdom, its massive skull tilted at an angle that suggested patient attention to the ongoing investigation of its people's lost civilization. "You know," Maya said quietly to the skeleton, "Sam always said you chose me just as much as he did. I used to think that was just an old man's fancy, but now I'm beginning to understand what he meant. This isn't just about preserving your bones or documenting your people's achievements. It's about changing how humanity understands the relationship between knowledge and power." The skeleton, of course, offered no response beyond its silent presence, but Maya felt a sense of communion with the ancient being that had become the center of her life's work. She'd learned to think of McKinnon 1 not just as a specimen to be studied, but as a teacher whose very existence challenged assumptions and opened possibilities that extended far beyond archaeology. The Institute's research had revealed that prehistoric giants possessed not just physical advantages, but cognitive capabilities that might have exceeded those of modern humans in certain areas. Brain volume was just one factor in intelligence, but the structural analysis of giant skulls suggested neural organization that emphasized different types of processing than the pattern that had emerged in Maya's own evolutionary lineage. What kind of knowledge might such beings have developed? What technologies might they have created using cognitive approaches that modern humans couldn't replicate? What insights into the natural world might have died with them when their civilizations disappeared from the historical record? These questions drove the Institute's ongoing research, but they also raised philosophical issues that Maya found both fascinating and troubling. If prehistoric giants had achieved genuine advances in understanding the world, if they'd developed technologies or social systems that surpassed anything in recorded human history, what did that say about the nature of progress itself? Maya had come to believe that human development wasn't a linear progression toward greater knowledge and capability that most people assumed. Instead, it appeared to be a cyclical process of achievement and loss, discovery and forgetting, advancement and collapse that had repeated multiple times over the millennia.
prehistoric giants represented evidence that civilization had risen to great heights before, only to fall so completely that later peoples had no memory of what had been accomplished.
The implications were both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because they suggested that modern achievements might be less unprecedented than people believed, that humanity had solved complex problems before, only to lose the solutions through war, disaster, or simple neglect. Inspiring because they demonstrated that human potential, in whatever form it took, was capable of extraordinary accomplishments under the right circumstances. Dr. Chen joined Maya in the exhibition hall, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the satisfied expression that indicated successful completion of important research. "The Chinese genetic samples confirm our working hypothesis," Chen announced, settling into one of the chairs that Maya had placed beside McKinnon 1 for contemplative conversations. "We're not looking at isolated anomalies or random mutations. The giant specimens from North America, Siberia, and China all show consistent genetic markers that indicate a stable population of considerable size and geographic distribution." Maya accepted the coffee gratefully, savoring both its warmth and the satisfaction of another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Any indication of what might have caused their extinction? Disease? Climate change? Conflict with other human populations? Chen's expression grew more serious. "That's where the analysis becomes troubling. There's evidence of deliberate violence in several specimens, not random predation or accidental injury, but systematic trauma that suggests organized warfare. The Chinese specimens show similar patterns, and Dr. Volkov has documented comparable evidence from the Siberian sites." Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana evening air. The possibility that prehistoric giants had been deliberately exterminated by other human populations raised questions about the nature of humanity that she wasn't sure she wanted to answer. "Are we looking at evidence of genocide?" Maya asked quietly. "It's possible. The evidence suggests a coordinated campaign against giant populations across multiple continents, occurring roughly simultaneously according to carbon dating analysis. Either there was remarkable coordination between widely separated human groups, or some other factor triggered violent competition for resources during that time period." Maya thought about the implications of systematic violence against an entire branch of humanity, about the possibility that her own species' ancestors had committed crimes against their evolutionary cousins that dwarfed anything in recorded history. If prehistoric giants had been deliberately exterminated, their suppression from historical records took on an even darker significance. Not just the hiding of inconvenient evidence, but the concealment of humanity's greatest crime. But such speculation, however disturbing, was exactly the kind of open inquiry that the Institute had been created to support. Maya had learned that truth was often uncomfortable, that important discoveries frequently challenged cherished beliefs and comfortable assumptions. The role of legitimate science was to follow evidence wherever it led, regardless of whether the destination was pleasant or convenient. "We'll continue the investigation," Maya decided. "If our ancestors committed genocide against the giants, that's a truth that needs to be documented and understood. Hiding from uncomfortable history doesn't make it less real, it just makes it more likely to be repeated." Chen nodded, her expression reflecting the same commitment to difficult truths that had brought her to the Institute in the first place. The Chinese researchers have agreed to expand the collaboration to include sites in Mongolia and Tibet. We may be able to create a comprehensive timeline of giant civilization and its disappearance that covers the entire Northern Hemisphere.
As they sat in comfortable silence beside the ancient bones, Maya reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. 5 years ago, she'd been a ranch hand with a high school education and no particular ambitions beyond proving she belonged in a place that had given her sanctuary. Now, she was directing international research collaborations that were rewriting human prehistory and challenging fundamental assumptions about the nature of civilization itself. The transformation had been possible only because Sam McKinnon had seen potential in a frightened teenager that she hadn't seen in herself, and because he'd been patient enough to nurture that potential through years of education and gradual responsibility. Maya had learned that the most important discoveries often emerged not from credentialed experts, but from ordinary people who refused to accept that some knowledge was too dangerous or too complex for them to understand. That lesson had become the foundation of the Institute's educational philosophy. Students weren't required to have advanced degrees or prestigious academic credentials. They were required to have curiosity, integrity, and the courage to pursue truth even when it challenged established authority. Maya had discovered that such qualities were much rarer than academic credentials, but also much more valuable when it came to making genuine breakthroughs in understanding. The Institute's success had inspired similar facilities in other countries, creating a global network of independent research institutions that operated outside traditional academic hierarchies. The movement represented a democratization of knowledge that threatened established institutions, but also created opportunities for discoveries that might never have emerged from conventional research programs. Maya's radio crackled with a message from the Institute's security team, reminding her that the facility operated under constant protection due to ongoing threats from groups that still sought to suppress or steal the discoveries housed there. The suppression network that Dr. Whitmore had represented hadn't disappeared. It had simply adapted to new circumstances, shifting tactics while maintaining its fundamental commitment to controlling dangerous knowledge. But Maya no longer felt intimidated by such threats. The Institute had grown too large, too visible, and too well connected to be silenced through the subtle pressure campaigns that had worked against isolated researchers in the past. More importantly, the knowledge that the Institute protected had been shared too widely to be contained even if the facility itself were destroyed. Copies of McKinnon 1's complete genetic sequence existed in laboratories around the world. Detailed documentation of giant archaeological sites had been distributed to researchers on every continent. The legal precedents that protected private ownership of archaeological discoveries had been codified in international agreements that would make future suppression efforts much more difficult to sustain. Maya had accomplished what Sam McKinnon had hoped for when he'd entrusted his discovery to a young woman who'd proven she could learn whatever was necessary to protect important truths. The giant skeleton story had been told. Its implications had been explored, and its existence had opened doors to understanding that could never be closed again. As Maya prepared to leave the exhibition hall, she paused for one final look at McKinnon 1, the ancient being whose bones had transformed her from a ranch hand into a guardian of hidden history. The skeleton seemed to glow in the soft lighting. 15,000 years of suppressed truth finally exposed to the world that had tried so hard to deny its existence. "Thank you," Maya whispered to the bones, though she wasn't entirely sure whether she was addressing the ancient giant, Sam McKinnon's memory, or the forces of circumstance that had brought them all together in this unlikely story of discovery and revelation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new discoveries, and new opportunities to expand human understanding of its own incredible journey through time. Maya McKinnon, former ranch hand and current director of the world's most important archaeological research facility,
was ready for whatever came next.
The truth, once revealed, had a way of multiplying, creating space for additional truths that had been waiting their own turn to emerge from the shadows of suppression and denial. Maya's work was far from finished, but the foundation had been laid for generations of researchers who would continue the investigation of humanity's hidden past. Under the vast Montana sky that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the emergence and extinction of entire species, and the endless cycle of discovery and loss that defined the human experience, the McKinnon Institute stood as a monument to the simple principle that knowledge belonged to everyone, and that truth, however uncomfortable, was always worth revealing. 6 months later, Maya stood before a packed auditorium at the Smithsonian Institution, presenting her findings to the world's leading archaeologists. The giant skeleton, now officially recognized and displayed in the museum's main hall, had rewritten human history textbooks across the globe. Dr. Whitmore and his organization faced federal investigations for their suppression activities. The McKinnon Ranch became a protected archaeological site, and Maya received the National Medal of Science for her courage in revealing humanity's hidden past. As she looked out at the audience of scientists who once dismissed her, Maya smiled. The scared 16-year-old who had hidden in Sam's barn was gone, replaced by a woman who had proven that truth always finds a way to surface. The giant's story was told, their legacy preserved, and Maya had kept her promise to both Sam and the ancient bones that had changed everything. The dust had finally settled in Clearwater County, but Maya Delgado's name would be remembered forever as the woman who gave humanity back its lost history. What an incredible journey! If this story of courage and hidden truth inspired you, please like and share it with others. Subscribe for more amazing stories of people who refused to give up when the odds were against them.